The worm. I was 4,781 fathoms below the surface of the ocean. There are certain terms in marine biology for describing open ocean, which is known generally as the pelagic zone. The pelagic zone consists of certain groups and subgroups, not unlike the biological taxonomic rank. There's the sunlight zone, which consists of the epipelagic zone, where most sunlight can penetrate, and the mesophilic zone, where 1% of sunlight or less can penetrate. There's also, of course, the midnight zone, consisting of the bathypelagic zone, where the ocean is exceptionally deep, and the abysmal-pelagic zone, the abyss. There's also, of course, a zone past where the ocean is exceptionally deep, the hadopelagic zone, while the abyss-pelagic zone was named for, quite aptly, the abyss. The hadal zone is so incredibly awe-strikingly deep that it is almost part of the underworld, and thus named after Hades. While this zone may sound like the most interesting for the layman, humans just love the deepest of the deep, or the tallest of the tall. The hadal zone is quite figuratively hell for marine biologists. Unlike Hades, the real underworld isn't quite brimming with the souls of the dead, or living for that matter. My colleagues were afforded the opportunity to explore the epi or the mesopelagic zones, very often finding new and exciting life. My team was very unfortunately assigned to the Trench of the Pacific. The team, consisting of just me. I suppose they thought that sending more than one person to the Trench of the Pacific was a waste of time. Suffice to say, I was not happy to be where I was. Like any marine biologist starting out, I was excited to make new discoveries. Maybe I discover a new shark or whale. Of course, when I learned that most marine biologists focus on microorganisms and plankton, my spirits were not dampened. There was still room for discovery. But when I learned that I'd be thousands of feet underwater in a cramped submarine for weeks on end, my spirit was finally crushed. I'd be the only damn organism for miles. Fine, it's alright. I wouldn't care. I'll be fine. Being alone fit me much better than being near others anyhow. I'd be so deep, you know, almost like a pioneer, a real Christopher Columbus. They'd say we discovered more of space than our own ocean, which doesn't make sense, of course, seeing that how space is infinite and our ocean isn't. But whatever, I was perfectly content reading my literature and contemplate how much of a mistake I had made with my life. And watch, always watching, through the reinforced glass floor, watching despite there not being anything to see. Watching the ocean floor for so long starts to hurt your eyes. Gave me a real headache. Constant blue light. From the bottom of the submarine, of course. So when I thought I saw something below, I convinced myself it was an apparition. Much too odd to possibly be real. In hindsight, maybe I wished it wasn't real. Eventually a sub was right above it, and I figured maybe I wasn't driven completely insane. Deep-sea gigantism is a phenomenon in which species of deep-sea dwelling animals are much, much larger than species from shallower waters. Maybe you've seen a picture of a monster isopod or herd of massive deep-sea spider crab, or the legendary king of herrings, or just possibly the infamous giant squid. Either way, it was known universally that normal-sized invertebrates can grow to massive proportions in the deep sea. The reasons are still debated, but the phenomena is known. Maybe the phenomena of deep-sea gigantism is what convinced me that the worm could be real. God, I wish I wasn't such a smartass. The worm was perfectly round, as any worm is. I couldn't quite be sure, but with the light being blue, but I believe it was a bit red. As for its size, it was absolutely massive, the diameter of 3 stories at least, maybe 4 or 5. Seeing the creature of the deep, I was immediately intrigued. I could become world-renowned. Every marine biologist would know my name, as I'd discovered the world's biggest worm. Maybe even the world's biggest invertebrate. But I had to be sure, so I redirected the submarine to follow the worm upwards, following towards what could be its head, or its tail. I'd have to find out. The commencing hours felt like hundreds. The sub slowly inched along, following the worm to wherever it went. Finally, I arrived at the end. Despite being absolutely massive, the worm finally tapered off, though it formed a triangle-like shape at the end. There was no aquatic worms with triangle-shaped ends. Holy shit, I thought. I discovered a new species of worm, and the biggest ever at that. I will be praised worldwide. But I still had to see the head though. So for the next 3 hours, my sub trekked onwards, towards the other end of the worm. And the time felt endless, and with nothing else to do, I watched the worm, for all 3 hours. During the last hour, I noticed something. The worm was at a slight incline upwards. It wasn't active moving upwards. It just happened to be angled upwards as I followed it. After following the worm for as long as I could, and for a couple 100 feet upwards, I came towards a cliff. The worm seemed to go into a hole in the cliff, and I figured I was a bit screwed. A worm's head is very useful in identifying the species, so if I can't make an accurate depiction of its head, I won't be able to truly declare that I discovered a new, massive worm species. So, I figured there was only one thing I could do. I could go over the cliff and search for any signs of the worm on the other side. The cliff wasn't very much like a mountain. It climbed upwards vertically for a few thousand feet, at least, and then formed a bit of a roundish top, and then immediately went downward. It was almost like a plateau, but not quite. The rock was an odd color. From what I could tell, it seemed almost off-red. As I reached the top of the cliff, I turned on the forward light to the submarine and aimed it straight ahead. I wanted to be able to see if the worm's head popped out in front of the cliff anywhere. Moving a few 100 feet back from the cliff, I started the slow descent downward. Deep-sea creatures don't have traditional eyes. There isn't any sunlight under the ocean, so most don't have eyes at all. The ones that do have massive retinas that can see the little amounts of bioluminescence that may be generated, but they don't have any types of eyes you might see on fish or on humans. It was only a few minutes after I started descending with the sub that I noticed movement on the cliff. No, not on the cliff. It was as if the entirety of the cliff itself was moving. So I watched, closely, all the rumbling of what I thought was a volcano. And as I watched, 2 massive, bloodshot yellow eyes opened themselves and stared right back at me. And as I looked up, and noticed the horns many fathoms above me, and I realized that I had just awoken deep from his eternal slumber. Mortals should never have delved into the underworld.